Thank you very much, Greg. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to everybody who has joined us today from all parts of the nation. Do appreciate your time, and will do my best to give you a little bit of a taste of self-herding basics and the animal behavioural work that we're doing. And I'm truly excited and passionate to be able to share it with you. So, first question, what is self-herding? So it's a whole new field of science that actually applies behavioural principles to livestock and wild animals. Today we'll mostly be talking about the livestock side, but these principles do apply right across the animal world. So it builds upon these behavioural science principles in order that you can start to allow animals to make choices that better align with your management instead of trying to force them into something that they don't wish to do. So very importantly too, right up front, the third sentence there, it needs to be cheap and easy. Otherwise, behaviourally, I wouldn't as a human do something that is expensive or difficult. So they're part of the human parts here too. The practical application of this is a real life thing that can be done in amongst your other farming or pastoral activities. So it's an Australian innovation, co-invented by Dr. Dean Revell and myself. Dean Revell led the Enrich shrub program out of CSIRO for 7 years. It won a Eureka Prize for Science, indeed the first sustainable agricultural prize for that. And self-herding has been a synthesis of that work and many other fields of science, of practice and knowledge and experience. And importantly, what we've been able to do and continue to do as this evolves is developing new tactics with land managers. So it isn't a top-down approach with the answers to the localised problems. It's actually starting from the bottom up, but we use behavioural science principles to obtain locally relevant answers. Self-herding is level 4 on the competencies evolution with livestock handling. I won't dwell too much on this. There's a listing there, as you can see, of what has come along in this last 35 years. And importantly, this isn't disparaging any other prior levels, far from it. Foundations of this come from the prior levels, but the higher the level that you achieve with behavioural modification, the larger the number of options that you can exercise as a manager across your property or the landscape in general. So what is the big idea of self-herding? Well, at its best, it's actually establishing mechanisms that have managed migration around landscapes, whether your property is large or small, and that influences the whole way that the dynamic of livestock interact with the whole landscape. So when we're talking about grazing, we're not just thinking about the mouths here, we're thinking about the mouths and the hooves and the recycling of nutrients. So the consumption, the impaction and the deposition are all three things that we will influence by getting the animals to choose to go round to parts of the landscape that otherwise they might not do. And so this set of procedures isn't a straight linear line of things. It's more like imagining you're riding a horse. You can have general instructions, but then constantly there's a feedback loop between you and the horse of how you're riding. So it is with self-herding. And it importantly allows great productivity increases because it's still allowing the livestock to express their individual choices as well as the group choices. And we are going to guide them towards our goals. So they tell us where to start, but we show them where to finish. A fair question would be, well, why don't we just leave them alone and let them do their own thing? And that would be quite reasonable. Well, the reason that we can have an active role in is because they are creatures of habit, just as we are creatures of habit. And so we tend to repeat our influence on specific areas more than if we are encouraged to go to experience new things. So just as somebody who has been a world traveller when they were young has a much more expanded view of their possibilities, so it is with our animals. We can start to expand their level of experience, even if they're only spending the same amount of time on the place, by taking an active role in their grazing patterns. So what can you do with self-herding? Well, here's a broader list, and then the next slide shortly will go into some more specifics. But in general, if we start thinking about we having the ability to get the animals to choose to be in different places for us where we indicate, then that starts to change the way plant growth, vegetation cover, and of course the whole nutrition spectrum of what the animals are utilising, than if we just leave them to repeat the usual habits. And as a consequence of that, you can start to indulge in grazing management principles without having to put up infrastructure to achieve those results. So if you think about grazing management, falls down to two main principles: population control and distribution. Self-herding squarely impacts how the animals are distributed across the landscape, and so that assists you with your grazing management, whether we're talking large or small areas. And if you wish to have animals more resilient to change, either they need to be relocated to some other part of your property, or perhaps they're going off your property to feedlots or other end users. How resilient are they to change? How ready are they to adapt to their new surroundings and start performing immediately? We can put sight, sound and smell signals into our landscape that become familiar, and therefore repeat that on their journey down the road, which accelerates their adaptation to their new surroundings. And also your mustering efficiency, especially if we're talking coming out of rough country of any description, then that is greatly enhanced, because now you have a set of tools to pull on the string as well as push on the string. So you start to engage in quite a few new and different games, if you like, that were unavailable previously if we were just relying upon force. So specifically, what can we do? How can this help you on your own place if you're running your own property? Well, you can start to get the animals to choose to go to places that they weren't previously showing that they would, and stay there. Whether you're installing new water points or if you're weaning and those sort of things, we start to break the very, very strong habits to return just to home, because you are going to establish some regular familiarity in the new spot. And we've covered the fact that your mustering can head towards more like gathering rather than forcing. And by rotationally grazing without the costs, there provides a number of different opportunities for you to start to implement grazing management in different ways. And if you have already initiated more intensive grazing management, it gives you a better payoff for the money that you've invested in either water or wire to get the animals to reside in certain parts of your property. Now, within those segments, you can start to do mini rotations within those. And if you start doing that, that starts to obviously take the pressure off any fragile areas without having to take them completely out of production. Another point listed there is gathering groups for higher mating percentages. If we're putting bulls or rams into a situation, well, we want them to have plenty of opportunities to mix and frequently keep remixing with the females that we're wanting them to join up with. So maximising that opportunity means you want to have tools that can actually bring them together and are working at all times of the day and night. And if you're bringing in new animals, purchasing them from somewhere else, well, how do we get them to adapt as quickly as possible and learn the ropes in their totally new world that they've arrived in? We start putting familiar signals in front of them and then educate them about your new property, their new surroundings, and get them to experience all of that on their own terms, but being guided in a positive way. So something I already mentioned, but we're really going to make some repetition the mother of retention here, that what we're talking about is using mostly a path of choice rather than force, getting the animals to choose the options we want. I do wish to be clear with all of you that that is not meaning that force is necessarily a bad thing. I am not saying that. It's just a different toolbox, a different set of tools. So the options that choice gives you is that you can be putting things out in the landscape that work for you all day and all night, all the year round, in order that you can use that set of signals in other ways and in other spots to help you out. So this is where choice is an interesting pathway, because it can take animals to places where you could never force them. It would never be a practical alternative to force them to go into some circumstances, whereas you may use choice tools to get there. So we replace existing habits and behaviours with new ones. A very important point. We're not trying to break habits. We're going to replace old habits with new habits. And we do this by pairing or queuing up signals with positive experiences. So it's important for you to come away from today knowing that this isn't about taking lollies around the landscape, about feeding animals and incurring a lot of cost by just feeding them desirable things. No, we're going to use those desirable foodstuffs only as a means to an end that we're pairing a signal strongly with those. And then we strengthen that periodically as we go around, but it's the signals that are the big deal. The signals are what we're going to use to take the animals around the landscape. And on the right-hand photo, there's two different signals there. We're using a witch's hat or traffic cone there as a visual signal for the animals, and in the tree is an old fire extinguisher that's been hollowed out and is acting just like a wind chime in that particular example. And so there's the sound and the sight cues that we're using in that particular example, which are much more important than what have we put in those drums occasionally. So we are using our signals to do all the hard work for us. So we're not going to provide our treats or rewards all the time. Too much bother, too expensive, too impractical, especially if you're dealing with really large properties. So we are going to pair those signals, so those rewards, pardon me, with the signals. And then the animal's desire to come to the signals is those big words there in bold, the anticipation of the reward, driving and reinforcing the behaviours. Anticipation of reward is a much bigger driver than rewards themselves. And what we're actually developing then is an addictive behaviour to go towards the signals we've chosen. And it is somewhat in the same way that poker machines operate on people. It's the addiction that the addictive behaviours and the addiction to going to that spot, which is the driver, not so much the jackpot reward. On the right-hand side there, we've got sight and sound, and I've mentioned that before, and also we have very simple tools of what you've put in that little squirt bottle to initiate smells. So all of those three things, we're going to initiate those in the beginning in places where the animals are feeling very familiar and content and home ground before we take them out into the new and novel places. And here's how it works right at the basics for animals, and indeed even for us humans. Your expectations trigger a behaviour, and then your experience, if it's positive from trying that behaviour, is a reinforcement, and so it re-triggers the desire to go and try that behaviour. Over time, this builds very, very quickly your trust and confidence. So that encourages more exploration and adaptation. So in the same way that caring parents gradually take their children into more and more interesting or exciting or challenging experiences, that's the way we're going to use this with our animals as well. You start the steps towards getting a virtuous cycle of the, in our case here, the animals continually trying new things, and then they're driving more expansive behaviours even when you're not around. And it's a feedback loop that extends from the animals back to the people, because they're paying very, very strong attention to how and what is being done. And when we look at this photo, there's a lot of learning going on there, even though there's only one animal at this moment in time getting a dietary reward. You can tell that they're concentrating on all sorts of things that are happening out of picture, as well as what's happening at that trough. And so animals that start to make that association of, I know what to expect when I hear, smell and see what is familiar to me, and I trust that that's going to be a positive experience for me to give that a try, that strongly influences every other animal that's looking at that behaviour. So an individual can greatly shape the mob situation by the strength of their behaviour. And when we're interacting with individuals, when you look at the right-hand photo, there's lots of observers there as a little treat is being delivered to an animal, and they're all learning. So this is really making a very strong point. We are not delivering feedstuffs out there to go and feed every animal. We don't need to. They just need to be able to observe that there is a strong reward, and some of the animals are engaging in that, for many of the rest to start to want to join in that activity. And so as they learn at mother's side when they're young, so they can learn by your interventions in very low-cost ways. And what's driving this right at a bodily or a cellular level is familiarity and diversity. So that dual drivers of behaviour are all the time with us as well as with our animals. There's three sets of photos there. The top right-hand one is tracking of cows with two separate different cows going off a single water point in a pastoral situation. The bottom left photo with yellow is actually a domestic cat, and that track is taken in central west New South Wales in a town. And the one on the right is actually a wedge-tailed eagle, a young one that fledged near Perth, and between March and May went all the way up to Lake Argyle in the north of Western Australia, and then came back home. Two things are happening in all those sets of tracks, and you'll see it even with, if you're tracking seals or whales in the ocean, familiarity and diversity. You want to spend the most amount of time in the place that's familiar. And why is that a useful thing? Is because it's easiest for you to get the resources for what you need. It doesn't ever supply everything that you need, and that is your strive for diversity. And why would an organism want diversity? Well, because your cells are differentiated, haven't they? From your hair cells on top of your head to your toenails on your feet, they're all different cells, and so diversity in foods actually helps the whole organism nourish all the various different micro needs of that organism. It doesn't take away from the fact that you're still going to need energy, protein, minerals, vitamins, that usual pyramid, but underneath that, in a much broader part of the pyramid, is a huge number of phytochemicals available to our animals in micro doses amongst the various plants they're encountering, and they're highly attuned to go and sample from all of those. And we can help give them the broader range of diversity by encouraging them to partake in something that gives them a positive feedback loop. And all of this is interconnected to the broad consequences that happen out in our landscape. And so when we provide a stimulus, if that's rewarding and provides any internal feedback as well as external feedback, that then goes and starts to change both the individuals and the groups, and encourages the animals to actually have a wider diversity of diet than if we just left them alone. So the animal experience isn't static, it isn't all intuitive. We can have a role in that and start to move that whole spider web of interactions in a positive fashion. So with successful self-herding, you'll be thinking about these main points, that if an animal feels forced, then it's less experimental. That's not the reason that we won't be forcing them to reside in areas behind fences if we need to. That's still available to you. But if we want them to exercise the maximum amount of experimentation, then we want their anxiety levels down low. And so these interactions are strengthened over time, and you're going to build off the familiarity of their home ground advantage by using small amounts of attractants and rewards and placing them with signals consistently. And so then the consistent signal means a certain predictable thing for the animal, which builds their positive expectations, a real reason for them to go and visit your signal, and the trust that it's worth the effort. So those positive experiences reinforce a new behaviour. It doesn't have to be a strong positive reinforcement every time, but just enough to keep it going. So in the next 2 weeks, we're going to explore that in a more practical fashion, with next week, how to start self-herding on your place. And we'll be looking at real life examples from the field and how you can start to have an experience in this without receiving full training. And the 3rd week of our series will be showing you how to grow your business and grow your landscape at the same time, and to get before and after photos to be able to show what you've been able to do, such as you see in the picture there at the moment. And so we're driving on there to start to give you some of the taste of the expanse of the whole umbrella field of self-herding. And before the next sessions, or if you wish to in your own time, there is a free book available on self-herding which covers some of the basics and explains some of the tactics and tools. It's available at selfherding.com. It's the small brown booklet, a PDF version of which is yours for free when clicking on that site. And just before we launch into the question and answer session of our seminar today, just a short review, because repetition is the mother of all learning. Just to make it clear, we'll go through this very briefly. Self-herding is stage 4 knowledge. Animal behaviours, we can guide them by force or choice. Self-herding is about the toolbox of choices. We use the innate desires for familiarity and diversity to actually drive the desire of animals to go to the signals that we have made them have a habit to head towards. We're going to use sight, sound and smell to do that. And an important point to, of course, note is that they use smell and sound as their primary instincts, but we use sight as our main useful tool. Tools and tactics that we put in to work self-herding are wonderful in that they can work for you round the clock for no pay and very little investment all the year round for you to use when you wish to. And that lowers the investment needing for some major changes in your animals. And the number of uses that you can put self-herding to is really, really large. And it's almost limitless from the point of view that behaviour is like a blanket that covers everything. It doesn't matter what infrastructure we do, what breeds or species of animals, they all behave, and so do we. And if we take an active role in that whole process, then there are so many more things to be gained from behavioural science. So we'll go over to question and A. Thank you.